Very good afternoon to you. Breaking news, and the COVID inquiries found almost £10 billion spent on protective gear during the pandemic was wasted. The last phase concluded. Failures and systemic flaws left frontline workers without adequate PPE. Let's bring in our health correspondent, Ashish Joshi. Ashish, tell us more about what we're learning.
This is yet another damning indictment of the government's chaotic mismanagement. These were the people who were responsible for supply lines and procuring PPE when the country needed it most. This 279-page report lays bare just how ill-prepared the government was and how badly it handled securing vital supplies during the pandemic. This module deals with procurement. This was absolutely crucial in making sure that the country was protected. Health workers were guarded against this deadly disease, and patients had access to the medical equipment which would keep them alive. Well, this report says it simply wasn't prepared and the country struggled to cope. Baroness Hallett, the chair of the UK's COVID-19 inquiry, says the government spent almost £15 billion on PPE. And of that £15 billion, it wasted £10 billion on stock that simply wasn't fit for purpose. We'll all remember the images of those nurses wearing black bin liners, care workers wearing plastic bags because they didn't have the protective equipment they needed to look after the sick and the dying. Now, this report finds systemic failures, inadequate planning, in delays in getting the ventilators and the vital testing equipment that the country desperately needed. Baroness Hallett says the country entered the pandemic with its PPE stockpile in a perilous state, without enough vital supplies and with large quantities of expired equipment. There were no plans in place for emergency procurement or distribution. And we were, she says, simply not ready to compete in the global market race, and we were over-reliant on one single country, China. You'll remember too the high priority lane, which the government said would mean faster access to these vital goods. Well, that was heavily criticised as being unfair because suppliers with government connections received favourable treatment, undermining public trust at a moment when it was needed most. But she does stop at saying this report does not identify cronyism or corruption on the part of ministers and officials. They simply got it wrong with the introduction of this VIP lane. Now, this report does not feature evidence on the PPE firm MedPro linked to Tory peer Baroness Michelle Mone and her husband Doug Barrowman. They've been ordered to repay £122 million plus interest to the government for providing faulty PPE at the height of the pandemic. Mone and Barrowman deny any wrongdoing. There is some praise for the country's business and science sector for rallying to help. There's also praise for the army in providing vital logistical expertise. But ultimately, this report lays bare just how underprepared the country was in the face of this pandemic. Ultimately, we wasted millions and millions of pounds, and this led to unnecessary delays. That means many more lives could and should have been saved. So the headlines will always be who could have been saved. There were people who should have been better protected, health workers who were on the front line, key workers who needed that vital PPE equipment, and ultimately patients who needed access to vital life-saving equipment which didn't arrive in time. But the fact that the business community pulled together, there is also praise for the private and public sector partnerships that work together, and there is a list of 12 recommendations which Baroness Hallett says must go into the next pandemic to make sure that we are prepared.
COVID-19 pandemic in the procurement and distribution of PPE, ventilators and testing equipment. It marks a halfway point in the publication of the inquiry's reports, a process which I intend to complete by this time next year. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck, the world entered a desperate race to secure vital healthcare equipment and supplies. If governments failed to procure the required equipment and supplies, key workers, including health and social care workers, could not be properly protected. Their lives and the lives of those for whom they cared were put at risk. Governments, including those of the United Kingdom, were engaged in a fierce competition during the crisis. International demand skyrocketed, prices rose uncontrollably, and global supply chains buckled under enormous strain. At the same time, the emergency stockpile of PPE and other equipment available to the UK was inadequate to meet the huge surge in demand. In the global battle to procure equipment and supplies, the UK was simply not ready to compete. The UK entered the pandemic with inadequate and untested plans to increase its emergency procurement and distribution operations rapidly, and the bodies responsible were caught off guard. In the face of this fundamental lack of readiness, ministers and officials were forced to improvise. Untested emergency procurement and distribution systems had to be developed within days. Against this backdrop, decision makers were confronted with an unenviable choice: put large sums of public money at risk to buy equipment at the speed and scale the pandemic demanded, or slow the process down and potentially lose out to international competitors. They decided to take the risk and buy. Given the scale of the emergency, this was the right choice. To have done otherwise would have placed those working on the front line in the health and social care sectors and the wider public in unacceptable danger. However, had there been better planning, the choice would not have been so stark, and the decision to buy at risk was not without considerable cost and widespread waste. Under the pressure of responding to the emergency, mistakes were made, leading to the waste of public money, as well as allegations of cronyism and corruption. Furthermore, the structures established to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic did not sufficiently integrate procurement and distribution. It was difficult to work out what was needed, what was being supplied, and what was being transported. The technology and data systems for emergency procurement and distribution were outdated. These were systemic failures which could have been avoided. The total expenditure by the UK government and devolved administrations on PPE, ventilators and testing equipment between January 2020 and June 2022 was over £42 billion. Governments across the UK did not have the systems and processes in place for emergency spending at this scale. The waste of taxpayers' money was vast. It is a stark fact that of the approximately £15 billion spent on PPE, nearly two-thirds, almost £10 billion, was wasted. These figures demand a fundamental change in how the UK prepares for emergency procurement. Had ministers and officials been better equipped with appropriate plans, information and systems, procurement decisions would have been easier, fairer and far less costly, and equipment would have reached those who needed it faster. The public must be able to trust that their money is being spent by the government with propriety, fairness and transparency. I have found that public confidence, so important in an emergency, was undermined by the failures in procurement. There have been well-documented complaints about the quality of the PPE which was procured by the government and delivered to the front line. I have already examined how this affected those working in the health sector in my Module 3 report, and I will examine its impact on the social care sector in my Module 6 report to be published this autumn. One aspect of the response has understandably, and in my view rightly, been the subject of significant public concern: the high priority lane, also known as the VIP lane. Officials, under intense pressure from ministers to ensure that offers of help were being managed properly, established the high priority lane. However, it was a misguided attempt at prioritisation. In responding to the crisis, some suppliers were given favourable treatment simply on account of their connections with the government. The high priority lane embedded unfairness in the UK government's emergency procurement, where billions of pounds were at stake. It undermined the otherwise enormous and well-intentioned efforts made by procurement officials, and it undermined public trust in how the government chose to spend taxpayers' money during the pandemic. It should not have been set up, and it should not be repeated. I have examined the award of contracts to particular suppliers. One of these is PPE MedPro Limited, which is the subject of an ongoing criminal investigation. It is not this inquiry's role to determine criminal or civil liability. My findings about the process leading to contracts being awarded to PPE MedPro Limited will be published in due course, but only once any legal proceedings have been concluded, to avoid any prejudice to the investigation. There were, however, many positives in the response that we must not forget. Businesses and the public rallied enthusiastically to help. The UK had at its disposal the innovation, expertise, and the willingness of domestic life sciences and advanced manufacturing sectors to step up. This was evident in the design and production of PPE, ventilators, and testing equipment, all within the UK. Manufacturers retooled and businesses used their international connections to source supplies from around the world. The Army stepped in to provide its crisis response expertise and lend its skills to organising an extraordinary logistical operation. Although the lack of planning caused an unnecessary delay in procuring the PPE and other equipment that healthcare workers and others desperately needed, it was a positive feature of the subsequent procurement response that key healthcare equipment was obtained at the speed and scale the crisis demanded. The effective collaboration of the public and private sectors serves as an example of how governments should respond to future pandemics. The UK needs to build on these strengths. The country will not be able to respond effectively without engaging businesses and industry and ensuring that there is a plan to do so in advance of the next pandemic. The procurement and distribution workforce also needs to be more highly skilled and ready for deployment in an emergency. We cannot be reliant on improvisation or the army alone. The UK relies heavily on international supply chains. However, its supplier base was too concentrated in one country, China, and the capabilities of domestic manufacturers had not been considered adequately in planning. This left the UK vulnerable on both fronts. The country cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. I am today making 11 recommendations, which, when implemented in full and in concert with my previous recommendations, will ensure that the UK government and devolved administrations are better prepared for the next pandemic. The complete list of my recommendations can be found in the published report. At their heart is placing ministers and officials in the best possible position to make decisions on how to spend public resources in the pressure of an emergency and ensuring greater industrial self-sufficiency. Data must drive our crisis response. I have set an ambitious target for the UK government and devolved administrations within 3 years to digitalise their systems for the procurement and distribution of healthcare equipment. The real-time collection, sharing and analysis of procurement and distribution data will fundamentally improve the quality and efficiency of decision-making. Key healthcare equipment should be regarded as a strategic national asset. There should be a programme of strengthening domestic industrial resilience and ensuring that the UK's international supply chains are robust. New trading alliances to diversify overseas sources of supply should be established. The UK government and devolved administrations need to create an environment which encourages investment, research and development into the advanced manufacturing of healthcare equipment here in the UK. The changes I recommend are an investment in the resilience and preparedness of the UK. They are a small price to pay to ensure that next time the public can be confident in the crucial spending decisions that will have to be made, and that key healthcare equipment gets to those who need it at the right time. The effective procurement and distribution of healthcare equipment will be crucial in a future pandemic. A better prepared emergency procurement system will reduce the cost of obtaining essential supplies and will save lives.
Chair of the COVID inquiry there, Baroness Heather Hallett, giving her summary of the fifth phase of the inquiry. It's been looking at the expenditure and the procurement of things like PPE, personal protective equipment, criticising the vast waste, as Baroness Hallett put it, on pandemic procurement. So of the £14.9 billion that the UK and devolved governments spent on PPE, it's been found that £9.9 billion of that 14.9 was wasted. A vast amount of waste, she said. Also criticism of the VIP lane. You may well have heard of that. We'll bring you more details on the exact specifics, but we may be hearing from families of those affected speaking. Let's take you live to hear from them.
A catastrophic failure of preparedness that cost lives, wasted billions and allowed a privileged few to profit from a national emergency. Those consequences were avoidable. The human cost was felt in homes across the country, including my own. My mum, Christina Fulop, this photo was taken a week before she contracted COVID, was housebound and cared for by wonderful domiciliary care workers. During the second wave, they were expected to wear one thin medical mask, one of those thin blue medical masks, for an entire 8-hour shift, moving from one frail elderly person to another. This is how my mum sadly contracted COVID. She later died in hospital. That same avoidable tragedy was repeated in hospitals, care settings and homes across the country. My mum's care workers were not to blame. Like key workers across the country, they were asked to save the country without being given the protection they needed to save themselves and their families. They did so without a moment's hesitation. While ordinary people were doing the right thing, a privileged few saw a national emergency as a money-making opportunity. The evidence in this report is clear. The VIP lane was a textbook case of corruption and cronyism. No other country in the world had a VIP lane. It was a deliberate and shameful choice. It was a hidden route that gave anybody who knew the right people access to huge amounts of public money, our money, with little to no oversight or transparency. The result was that a few people got richer, while PPE didn't get to those who needed it. The VIP lane, as is made totally clear in this report, led to PPE procurement being less effective and more expensive. £10 billion, 2/3 of money spent on PPE was wasted on unusable PPE. Lives were lost as a result, including my mum's. Yet the full extent of the PPE scandal remains hidden from public view. An entire chapter of the report remains hidden until the National Crime Agency has finished its investigation into PPE MedPro. We demand the full truth and urge the National Crime Agency not to allow its investigation to drag on indefinitely. This report must now lead to action. The government must implement every recommendation in full, recover every pound possible and prevent political connections from ever again securing privileged access to public contracts. The next pandemic is inevitable, And once again, we are unprepared. We welcome the report's recommendations. It calls on the government to bring our PPE stockpile up to an acceptable standard within 12 months. And with another pandemic potentially round the corner, that is a task they must carry out with urgency. It is equally vital that we strengthen domestic manufacturing and ensure PPE fits everyone who needs it, including women, ethnic minority workers and disabled people. Had the last government prepared and listened to the warnings before 2020, many of our loved ones would still be here today, including my mum. We now call on the current government not to make the same mistake. We will continue our campaign until every recommendation is implemented and everyone who put profit before people are held to account. We will not stop until that work is done. Thank you. Thanks. Happy to take questions. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Reaction there from affected families, bereaved families, reacting to phase 5 of the COVID inquiry. And this is focusing on the preparedness of the equipment needed to keep essential workers and all of us safe. And in her report, the chair of the COVID-19 inquiry, Baroness Heather Hallett, found that the UK was in a perilous state when it came to the existing stockpiles of PPE. Only a third of the masks in England before the pandemic were usable. Scotland had no supplies of the top-level masks needed by healthcare professionals. And the report described procurement systems working under immense pressure, but with no effective system for the triaging of the offers of PPE. And the system that was set up was deluged, Baroness Heather Hallett found, with offers. That's after Boris Johnson and the then Health Secretary Matt Hancock issued a call for arms for PPE in April 2020. Officials found that the inquiry found that the call to arms made the situation, quote, matters worse. There was 25,000 offers within just 15 weeks, some days 300 offers a day. And against all of that was the VIP lane. It was referenced there by the bereaved families, saying that it was a money-making opportunity when the country needed the support. They said that the VIP lane was a deliberate and shameful choice. Well, Baroness Heather Hallett described the VIP lane as a misguided attempt at prioritisation that embedded unfairness in emergency procurement. There was more expensive contracts through the VIP lane, and they had contract performance issues more frequently than those awarded through the normal route. And it was found that 32 people had successful offers to the VIP lane accepted. 15 of those 32 had connection with the Conservative Party itself. None came from any other party, although politicians from other parties were referred to it. And whilst there was no evidence of cronyism or corruption on the part of ministers or officials, the final decision of whether to award a contract or to reject it, the system was inherently biased towards those with connections to the UK government. Let's just bring you a government statement that's just come through in the last few minutes. This government statement says the following. Today's report makes for sobering reading. The government thanks Baroness Hallett and her team for their thorough work on these serious issues. We'll consider the findings and recommendations in detail and respond in due course. The government remains committed to learning the lessons needed from the inquiry to protect and prepare us for the future. And Baroness Heather Hallett says that she has made 11 recommendations. They, of course, come in collaboration and alignment with the other recommendations made in the prior 4 stages of this inquiry. There are 10 altogether. Heather Hallett saying at the beginning of her comments at the top of the hour that she expected to resolve and complete this inquiry at this time next year. But the key figures to remind you of is that of the £14.9 billion spent by the central and devolved governments of the UK on PPE during the course of the pandemic, it's been found that £9.9 billion was wasted and that there was a lack of pre-preparedness when it came to supplies. Scotland, for example, had no supplies of the top-level masks required by healthcare professionals before the pandemic started. The government spokesperson saying that today's report makes sobering reading. We will bring you more. There's a lot to digest, a lot to get through. There'll be plenty more on the Sky News website and the Sky News app in the coming hours. It's 12:26 on a Tuesday afternoon. Let's take you to some of the day's other stories.